Well, I really can't imagine that there's anyone who knows San Francisco better than our next guest. He is the author of the bestseller Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco. He writes the weekly Portals of the Past column in the San Francisco Chronicle and has a podcast coming out with that same name. Welcome, my dear friend, Gary Kamiya. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Jenna. It's a pleasure.
Well, Gary, author, journalist, historian, I understand you've been really diving pretty deeply into what happened here in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1918 epidemic. What about that time period is similar or different from what we're going through now?
Yeah, I've been going through virtually every newspaper story. It's taken weeks. And it's remarkable. The main thing that strikes you is how incredibly different it was. There are similarities in the sense that obviously we're facing a tremendous medical emergency, but the order of magnitude of that one was just stunningly greater. I mean, they had more deaths than we have cases. We've had 40 deaths in San Francisco. That would be a moderate day of deaths for months during that epidemic. So they really got hammered, as most cities in the United States did. I mean, this was an absolutely dreadful pandemic. And the other major difference was that we are now, across the United States, by and large, receiving accurate and good and reliable scientific advice and advice from health officers on what to do, but largely through no fault of their own at the time. They didn't give such good advice, and they really didn't know what they were doing. I mean, they didn't even know that a virus was a virus. The measures they tried to implement were well-meaning, but largely ineffective. And it's not really clear what they could have done differently with the knowledge they had at the time. So, we've had an enormous blessing in the sense that we know better what to do than they did. And of course, here in California, and in the Bay Area in particular, we received the shutdown orders earlier than anywhere else in the country. And clearly, that is one of the main reasons that we've escaped the worst of this pandemic that's ravaged cities like New York and Detroit, New Orleans, and Los Angeles hasn't done quite as well as we have, but even Los Angeles has done better than many large American cities. So we can thank early shutdown for a lot of that.
As you've been looking through the annals of the past, what really strikes you? What really stands out? Maybe something that we learned that we didn't repeat this time around. What really stands out to you, Gary?
Well, one of the most interesting, fascinating things that happened that we can compare was the different reactions to the masks. San Francisco put tremendous faith in masks in 1918, and the citizenry largely complied with the mask orders through the entire first wave of the epidemic. The 19 epidemic in San Francisco came in two waves. The first was about twice as bad as the second, but the second was very bad. There was tremendous compliance. Some people said as high as 95%. There were fines, there was shaming, it was made very patriotic. It was all tied in with World War I and the war effort. But what happened was after the first wave subsided, and people began to feel safe, and they were really exhausted from having gone through this first unbelievably debilitating fight. And there was always skepticism that was not unwarranted about the effectiveness of these masks, partly because they were made of gauze. They weren't always worn properly, and the rules were odd. You had to wear them in public, but then you could go and sit in a crowded restaurant and take them off. And people began to grumble more and more. And by the time the second epidemic got going, people no longer wanted to wear them. And so it became a big showdown between the city's health officer, who was using a lot of the same arguments you hear today in the culture wars about masks and social distancing, but with the ironic difference that in those days, the people that weren't wearing them really had, good reason to be skeptical of the masks. And finally, the masks were ordered to be worn again. but the compliance was very poor, and they only had to wear them for a short time. It turned out that that was the end of the epidemic, basically, right at the same time that people began to wear the masks. So it was a fascinating difference between the orders to wear masks today, and you can make some comparisons with states that really have a very small
Absolutely.
amount of it, and it's absolutely understandable. It's not all just Trump supporting yahoos who are like screaming about the First Amendment and refusing on principle to undertake really reasonable public health measures. That's not all. That when people don't feel like they need to wear masks, if they're living in Calaveras County or if they're living in places that have 10 cases, there's actually rational reasons to some degree that they're not going to take it seriously as somebody living in Manhattan. And I think that there needs to be some understanding of that as well. It's not all ideological. There's actually some rational basis for people making these decisions, just as there was in San Francisco in 1918. You couldn't go to the well again. People didn't believe it. They sensed with their own common sense that it wasn't working. There were scientific studies on both sides. It wasn't as if the science was unequivocal. So that's an interesting lesson for today. I think people will listen, and we're very good in the Bay Area at, we're very science oriented. And I don't think we have this kind of infantile libertarianism where, like, I call it bad toilet trained libertarianism. Don't make me do anything. So it infringes on my liberties, which basically means no public health, because public health is infringing on your personal liberties. But I think that even here, as long as a rule seems reasonable and is effective, people will listen to it. If it comes to the time when it seems like you're being overly cautious or there's no actual connection between the rule and reality, people start to drop away. And that's human nature. And we really saw that a lot in San Francisco in 1918.
What do you think is the biggest thing happening right now in this city and in the Bay Area that we'll be talking about 100 years from now?
Wow, well, it's always hard to predict the future, but I think one thing we can look when we look back, I think we'll be proud of the fact that we did pull together, that we acted quickly, that by and large the city has been pulling on the same oar in the same direction, and really working hard to get this epidemic under control as rapidly as possible, so that we can reopen our economy and get things back to as close to normal as possible. So I think no one can predict what's going to happen. I think in the next 6 or 8 weeks, we're going to have a lot of information about the nature of this epidemic now that we're opening up so much of the country, and we'll see what happens with the caseload. And if we're very fortunate, the worst predictions won't come true, and perhaps we can open up faster, and perhaps we'll have a city that will look a lot like the San Francisco that we had before. There could be a worst case scenario in which it will not look like that, and in which we won't have half of our restaurants, and we won't have theaters, and we won't, it'll be a shell of its former self. There's all kinds of things that could happen. We could have, office buildings abandoned and turned into housing. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of what could happen. Closed streets, to have restaurants. Some of these changes could be really utopian. And already I'm enjoying this moment in San Francisco because I feel like it's our New Orleans moment. Everybody's got a go cup. Everybody's drinking on the streets. The parks are full of people socializing and drinking within their white circles. But I feel like outdoors, the dangers are much lower. I don't feel there's great irresponsibility there. And it's actually kind of a wonderful summer vacation feeling for people that have been inside for a really long time. So I'm enjoying that moment in the city's rebirth. And I think we'll look back hopefully and say we did what we needed to do, and hopefully we got through it without too much damage.
Maybe this has been kind of a nice reset. I know you've been here since what, 1970-ish.
Yeah,
I've been around for many, many
71,
years. Yeah, so I mean, I remember when it used to be there'd be this little traffic on the weekends. That'd be normal, and I am
right.
loving that. It does feel like we
No,
have a little bit of our good old wonderful city back, and that's
no,
not so hard.
yeah, I think that there are many things that people, are really enjoying about this, despite the horrors of it and the economic devastation. One can never forget that. But if you're talking about the actual experience of moving through the city, not only like going back to 1971, it often feels like you're going back to, the famous movie Dark Passage when Lauren Bacall drives Humphrey Bogart over the Golden Gate Bridge. There's like 4 cars on the Golden Gate Bridge, and when she gets to the San Francisco side, she has a lengthy conversation with a toll taker. It feels like that, and there's something delightful about that, and there's something delightful. I've been walking the streets, ever since the shutdown with my dog, responsibly, and it's exhilarating. It was exhilarating at first to see how empty it was, while also being disturbing and surreal and weird. And I think it brought out the deep, the natural beauty of the city and its kind of eternal quality. It's such a city that really is defined by its natural beauty, and that was just even more starkly revealed. But by the same token, of course, after the euphoria of that and being so close to that, then you want to go and have an espresso, have an Africano at the Cafe Trieste, or go into City Lights and get a book, or have a drink at Specs or Vesuvio. I live in North Beach, so these are all my references. And as time has gone on, and you realize none of those places are open, you realize that without those, beautiful as this city is, it's like a painted stage set. And we all desperately miss those places. And that's one of the reasons that everyone has been, getting their Go Cups and living out in the parks. But, we need to try to bring those places back, as every city does. The whole country is like a hollow shell of itself. And so it's a very strange feeling. It's both exhilaration and sadness and a sense of loss of what we had. So it's been a deepening experience in many ways, and I've been an opportunity to get a lot of work done and drink more. So it's been mostly fun, and I shouldn't say mostly fun. It's been a lot of fun, some challenges, and some some strange experiences that just one isn't one isn't ready for. So.
Yeah. Well, hey, I totally feel you on the drinking more. And cheers. Here's a virtual cheers to you. Gary,
Right.
just love you so much. Thank you so much for being here and for doing this.
Oh,
Hopefully
you're
we'll get to
welcome,
talk to you
Jen.
again very soon. Yeah, that's author Gary Kamiya. He is an author, a journalist, a historian. If you haven't yet, rush out and buy his book, Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco. Read his column every weekend in the San Francisco Chronicle, Portals of the Past. And if you love listening to that voice tell those stories, he also has a podcast, Portals of the Past podcast. All right. Next up, we look at, a million more really interesting things around our city. David?